So yeah, as Paul mentioned in his intro, so I work at Ordnance Survey, but also do various other mappy and creative bits in my spare time, which is where this project kind of comes into things really. So I worked on this piece of artwork really between September and December of last year. I think it's a little bit different potentially to some of the other things that people have spoken about today. It kind of is a cross-section of a lot of my interests, so cartography and also artwork. And there wasn't really very much, if any, GIS software that went into making this. So it's really quite a handmade one actually. So yeah, a little bit more on the arty side of things than some of the other stuff that I usually do. So this is the map I'm going to be talking about today. It is an A2 hand-printed lino print of Antarctica, as you can see, titled An Ode to the Antarctic, and I'll go into that a little bit more later on. But yeah, it's A2, so it's quite huge, and that is an A3 piece of lino on an A2 piece of paper. It's an original print, so when I printed it, they're all done by hand, and everyone's slightly different because the colour of the ink might be a little bit different, or the way that the ink transfers onto the paper on the print is a little bit different in each one. So they're all quite special actually, and a little bit unique, every single edition of this print that I've done. And this project that I completed over 4 months or so in 2020, it's quite a personal project to me actually. It's a culmination of a lot of different things that I'm interested in, Antarctica being one of them. And I'll go into that a little bit more later, but creating it was really kind of a labour of love. And obviously that was when we were in lockdown in the UK, and there was a lot of evenings and kind of weekends and things that went into this. It was a fab way to use up the time actually, as I think people have mentioned in sessions previously today. We had a lot of spare time on our hands, so it was nice to have something to really channel that creative energy into, and it's fab that it also has a map in, which is one of the things I'm really passionate about. So as a little bit of info about me and why I'm interested in Antarctica and all things polar really. So I have studied geography for a lot of years, right back to school, and I think I first started learning about polar science specifically during geography A level, and then I went on to Durham University to study BSc in physical geography, particularly focusing on modules like Antarctic science and glaciation. So there was a lot of different areas of my course that touched on these sorts of things, and that was what I really loved learning about actually. I was very lucky to have a chance to go and do some field trips in places like Norway, which is where this photo is from. So I got to go and stand on some and see it in with my own eyes, which I think really brings it to life actually. It's hard to imagine glaciers when you're learning about it in a classroom in England, so it's great to go and see them in the real world. And then I went on to write my dissertation at uni about the Antarctic Peninsula. So again, polar things, Antarctic science and glaciation. So yeah, kind of from a scientific perspective, it's something that I'm really interested in and kind of still like to learn about, even though I'm not working directly with stuff to do with Antarctica at the moment. And I think maps especially, so as I mentioned, I work at Ordnance Survey, but I think maps and visualizations can be a really fantastic and quite accessible way to relay that sort of highly technical scientific information to a wide audience. A lot of the time these things and stats and stuff are in very academically focused journals or really complicated articles and stuff, and it's a real struggle to actually understand what they're saying. So I'm quite a visual person, and I think that's what draws me to making maps and making visualizations that tell a story in quite an accessible way. And also people like to look at things that look nice. So if you make it look engaging and interesting, then I think it's a great way to convey that information to a wider audience. And a lot of the printmaking I do, so obviously I've done this Antarctic map and I do various other things as well in my spare time with printmaking. A lot of those are centered around quite strong environmental themes. And that's something I'm really passionate about actually. As well with volunteering for GISE, the not-for-profit, so that's quite centered on sustainability too. So it's kind of a thread that runs through a lot of the things that I do in my life. I work alongside Paul at Ordnance Survey, so I'm a technical relationship consultant, but really focusing most of my time on geographic data visualization. I joined OS about 2 years ago, almost to the day actually. I was on their graduate scheme for about 18 months of that, starting off doing GDV work, and then have come back to a permanent position doing that recently, which is what I really love actually and really passionate about. And then outside of work, I've kind of always got a bit of a creative project on the go, to be honest. I like to get a bit arty and make things where I can, when I've got a bit of time in the evenings and things like that. So when I'm not doing prints like this or making maps, I'm often kind of building furniture from recycled stuff, or a bit of sewing, a bit of knitting, a bit of painting. I'll give anything a go really. And I've actually got a small like arty business that I sell this print and many others through. I'll mention that at the end as well actually. So I thought it would be quite good to let you know kind of why I chose to make this print of Antarctica, and a little bit of the context about Antarctica as a place, which I think helps to tell that story that I'm trying to do with the print. So I've just got a few slides about a very brief intro into a bit of Antarctic science. You might know this or you might not, but I think it's a really special place on Earth, and that's why I wanted to focus my artwork on it. So it's one of the last kind of really true wild places on Earth. There's no permanent population that lives there. There's only really scientists that do their research work there for kind of a year or 2 years, or sometimes just a season. So there's been a pretty minimal impact of kind of human existence and human life on the continent. And that's why in the print, I've got a title called The Last True Wilderness, Antarctica. And I think that's why I want to include that, to kind of highlight how really important it is to preserve this really special place basically on Earth that's quite highly at risk at the moment. So specifically focusing on glaciers on this slide, I should play a little video here. Yeah, here we go. So I'm sure we've all seen kind of headlines about glacier retreat due to climate change. Antarctica's got a huge amount of ice, obviously, up to over 4 kilometres deep in some places, and actually 90% of Earth's ice is held within Antarctica, so it's a pretty substantial place. And if all of that was going to melt, it'd raise the global sea levels by 60 metres, so it's no small thing. And actually the really light colour, obviously the kind of the bluey whites of the glaciers, are really important in regulating the climate of our Earth, because they're so bright and white. They reflect a lot of the heat from the sun back up into the atmosphere, which helps to keep the Earth cool. It's also got really extreme climates in the continent, so a lot of things, a fact that a lot of people don't know about Antarctica is actually it's the largest desert in the world, which you wouldn't really think, because it's obviously not very hot. It really rarely rains or snows there, and when it does, it doesn't really melt, so it kind of compacts to make those ice sheets that we think of when we think about Antarctica. At the South Pole, there's actually only about 10 millimetres of rain a year, so it's really not very much at all. And it's also a really windy place as well. As the air rushes over the really huge mountain ranges in the continent, it can reach like over 200 miles an hour wind speeds, and they're called katabatic winds. So it's a pretty brutal place to be honest, especially in winter. Very cold and very windy. It's obviously at the south pole of the Earth, so because of that location, it's got 24-hour darkness in Austral or Antarctic's winter, and 24-hour sun in Austral summer. That means that the temperature patterns vary obviously a lot over the year, and there's only a few weeks in between those seasons that you get any sort of sunrise or sunset. Penguins, obviously everyone loves them. They're in Antarctica too. There's about 17 species which all live in quite distinct colonies around the continent, and they're also just really cute and live in these huge communities that I think people don't sometimes realise how large they are. They're massive actually, obviously larger than some cities, which is what it says on the slide here. And then finally, the Southern Lights. So similar to the Northern Lights, they happen at the South Pole when the kind of electrically charged particles collide with the magnetic field of the Earth. And then those particles accelerate towards the poles to cause the really nice colours that people like to take pictures of and go and see. They're a little bit less well known or well talked about, I guess, than the Northern Lights, just because they're so ridiculously remote to go and see. But it's the same process and kind of the same intensity that happens at the South Pole as well as the North Pole. And the green in the lights is caused by the oxygen in our atmosphere when the particles collide with that, and the bluey, pinky, purple tones that you sometimes see when they're a bit more strong are caused by the nitrogen in Earth's atmosphere. One other thing that I think is really cool about Antarctica, and that I think makes it quite a unique place on Earth, is that there's this kind of contract that a lot of countries in the world signed, I think it was about 50 years ago, called the Antarctic Treaty. And essentially what that says is that no one country officially owns any part of the continent. And so it's only used as a place to further scientific research and kind of understanding of our planet's climate and the systems that make Earth a livable place. So because of that, there's a lot of different countries and kind of scientists from different parts of the world that are working side by side very peacefully, you know, from countries that don't necessarily cooperate peacefully in other parts of the world, and with that kind of very core common goal of increasing scientific understanding, which I think makes it a really cool place actually. As I mentioned, I've been interested in Antarctica for quite a long time, quite a few years, but specifically wanted to create this map for a couple of reasons. And there was a couple of kind of things that I found that caused me to go on to design and then print this Antarctic map. So the first of those was a book by a painter called Edward Seago, who went to Antarctica on an expedition in the 1950s, mid-1950s, and painted the landscapes that he saw there. They're quite, there's an example of one on the bottom right of this slide, they're quite bleak, they're often quite monotone in the colours that are used. You know, that's obviously what Antarctica is like as a place. There's not loads of green and trees and things everywhere. But I like the monotone colours because I think it really depicts how vast and kind of powerful these landscapes are. And I chose to keep my print just a one monotone blue colour for that reason, so it's kind of echo that monotone landscapes of the continent. It's also really quite hard to do multicoloured lino prints. You need a lot of blocks and they all have to match up and line up really specifically, so it made my life a little bit easier as well. But yeah, I really like the monotone impact really, because it's such a bright bold blue that I've used, but everything's pretty much exactly the same shade. And then the second resource that I found that really inspired me to put this map together was a really cool find actually. It was a scrapbook that I found in a secondhand bookshop a few years ago, and it's basically a very personal depiction, a very anecdotal log that somebody's parent has put together. And this person went on an expedition to Antarctica's Brabant Island in the mid-1980s. And they have put together kind of like the postcards and the letters, the photos, logs of what the weather was like, all you know, glued it together, and it's kind of it's the physical copy. It's not a print or like a book that's been made from this. It's the actual scrapbook that was created. So it's got a huge amount of quite personal information and just really interesting details about what it was like as a place. I've tried to Google the person who it was written about and put together about, but I couldn't find anything, which is really unfortunate because I think it would be amazing to share it with them actually, because obviously it's about their expedition. But it's such a personal log of their time there and the practices. They went on to Scotland for kind of expeditions and things beforehand, and it tells an amazing story. So I was thrilled to bits actually when I found that, and I think that is really what motivated me to then go on and put this map together as kind of a bit of a tribute to all of the awesome stuff that goes on there, and also this really personal journal that I managed to find very luckily. So creating the actual map, the actual process of putting it together, I used a medium called lino printing, which is a form of relief printmaking. You might have heard that term before, where basically you have a block of something, in this case lino, that has raised areas and less raised areas. And when you ink up the block, so when you kind of use a roller to put ink on it, the raised areas will obviously have ink on and the areas that aren't won't. So you can form a bit of a picture as to what you want to print onto a piece of paper or whatever else you might want to print onto. And when I was designing the actual map in the middle of the whole image, I used a few different sources. So the British Antarctic Survey have this amazing like data portal basically, where there's loads and loads of data that's all free to download. including lots and lots of maps, both historic ones and current ones. So I used that a lot to kind of get the details and the place names and things that I wanted to include. And then there was also another website which is called Antarctic, it's on the screen there, which is a kind of database of Antarctic data that is designed to be used in QGIS, hence the Q. And it's a fab resource, actually. It's all open source, and I'd really recommend it if you're interested in mapping something Antarctic. There's loads and loads of data on there to have a play with. And I think one of the things that surprises people when I'm talking about this map is that I wanted to make it all geographically accurate. So obviously I'm a map maker as a job. It was important to me that this map was going to be accurate and you know, have as much correct data and as much detail as I could kind of get in as possible with the medium that I was using. So I wanted to include those things like place names, the names of the glaciers and the ice shelves, shading that works with the medium that I've used. So on the glaciers, I've used kind of hashed color where I can like do tiny little stripes, but when you're looking at it from a little bit further away, it looks like a slightly lighter blue shade. And then the meridian lines and things like that to give it a sense of context and as much detail as I could really on that kind of hand-carved map where you're doing it all at the same scale and you can't zoom in, unfortunately, to add more detail. And then there are images around the edge of the central map as well, which really tell the story, I think, of Antarctica. And I wanted to include elements of the continent that kind of bring to life the unique geographical phenomena that happen there. So I've got the Southern Lights on there. I've got glaciers kind of carving off into the sea and leaving these huge chunks of icebergs. I've got a sun and a moon to represent the kind of 24-hour sunlight and darkness that is there in summer and winter. And then also the title that I used, so I've included a picture of the title here. I wanted it to feel a little bit like a kind of old-fashioned explorer's guide with that phrase, the last true wilderness, that I mentioned earlier. I think the medium that I've used, it's obviously all hand printed and it hasn't really changed a huge amount in the last few hundred years, I guess, since people have been doing relief printmaking. So I wanted to feel a little bit kind of timeless and use be quite measured in my use of fonts as well to give it that kind of vintage feel, which I think hopefully I've achieved. And then a little bit more, so specifically kind of transferring the design onto the lino that you use. So I drafted that first initial design using pencil and paper, just on really basically 2 A4 sheets of paper sellotaped together because I didn't have any A3, and drew my map up onto there. And then once I'd done that, I essentially traced it, so like flipped the paper over onto the piece of lino, scribbled all over the back to transfer the image onto the A3 lino block. And lino is basically just a kind of very rubbery, flexible material. It's basically the same stuff that you have on your floor in your kitchen potentially. And then once the image is on that block, it's all backwards, so that provides its own challenges in itself, because all of the text and everything and all of the details that you're carving out are backwards. They're all done in negative whilst you're doing the majority of the work, so that when you then go to print it onto your paper, it obviously all appears the right way around. That makes it a little bit difficult to spell stuff right a lot of the time. There's been a few instances where I've spent weeks on a print and then I've done it and I've realised I've spelled something wrong, which is a bit of an annoying feeling. But yeah, it all went okay on this one, so that's good. But yeah, the fact that it's all in negative is something you definitely have to bear in mind. And then once that image is on your lino, you can use a kind of sharp gouging tool, and there's different sizes of these depending on how much detail you want or how small you're trying to carve your lines out. And you carve away the areas that you don't want your ink to be, and you leave the areas that you obviously do want the ink to transfer onto on the block. So I used probably like the smallest, I think it was 1mm V-shaped gouge for most of this print, because it's pretty intricate, especially with the contours that are all geographically, correct. So I wanted to make sure that they were going to be as accurate as I could get them. And it was quite a fiddly job to get them all carved out, to be honest, but we got there. And I think something as well that I quite like about printmaking and this medium is that you don't really know exactly how it's going to look until you've actually pulled your first print and you've kind of printed it onto paper for the very first time, because you're seeing it all in negative, and obviously it's all backwards as well. It's quite hard to actually visualize what it's going to look like. So it's often a nerve-wracking moment doing that first print, but actually I was really pleased with this one. So there wasn't too many edits I had to go back and do. I've included some pictures of the process of carving it out and designing the map. It took me about 4 months, so September to December 2020, from having the kind of first idea and drawing the map for the first time to pulling the first print off the block. And that was doing it in my evenings and weekends and things around my job at OS and various other kind of creative pursuits that I had going on at the time. This drawing on the screen at the Mo is the first version of the map that I put together. So it's just the pencil on paper sketch, really. As I said, there's quite a lot of intricate lines, especially towards the coast where there's steep cliffs and glaciers and things. Carving all of those out was quite a challenge, but it was quite fun, actually. It was something to focus on during the lockdown, and actually it was pretty fiddly. I had to wear a head torch sometimes when I was doing it so that I could get such a bright light to be able to do it as detailed as I possibly could. I've got some pictures here from when I was first creating the map. So on the left-hand side is the pencil drawing of some of those images around the edge of the map, showing the Transantarctic mountains and kind of the huge icebergs that are breaking off and floating into the Southern Ocean. And then the middle image is where I was carving out the mountains, so you can see the writing and things there is all in reverse. Creating shading, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is something that's a bit hard to do when you're just using one colour. It's quite a binary alternative of either something's got ink on it or it hasn't, so it's either going to be printed or it isn't. So I had to get a little bit creative with how I was going to make a slightly 3D effect and have a bit of shading. So I used that kind of stripy pattern to give it a little bit of depth. And then on the right hand side, you can see a close-up of some of the text that is labelling the different areas in Antarctica. So it's not a particularly deep carve that you can see, like it's only a couple of millimeters, but it's enough to not get ink on when you then go to roll ink all over the block. And then this slide has got some pictures from, I think this was about a month or two after the ones on the previous slide, when I'd carved out most of that central map. And you can see it's quite fiddly, and the little fingernail on the right shows just how small some of that writing was. I don't know if anybody's ever tried lino printing, but you'll be able to appreciate that doing quite small stuff like this is pretty tricky. And actually, if you are like holding the gouge that you use to carve it out with and your hand slips, you can kind of cut out a huge chunk of something that you didn't want to, which is always quite frustrating. You can glue it back on, but it's a tricky process to get it to line up exactly right. Here I've just got a time lapse of carving the label for the Bellingshausen Sea. It looks really quite fiddly, but it does get easier. Oh, there we go. It does get easier with practice. It's small letters, but once you kind of get your head around how the lino works with the gouge that you're using, you can just about do it as small as like you want, really. And so, yeah, this was the final product. I have, as you can see, the central map surrounded by lots of images around that, and I wanted to link those images back to the Antarctic sites and things that I'm really passionate about. So I said I've got the sun and the moon to the left and right of the title to represent that 24-hour sunlight and 24-hour darkness. And then the southern lights on the top right hand corner, the Aurora Australis they're called. And then these huge mountain ranges on both sides in the background are the kind of Transantarctic mountains, and there's really, really huge mountain ranges in Antarctica, actually, kind of over 4,800 meters. So it's not all just big flat ice shelves like we might imagine. Then there's obviously some icebergs carving off those glaciers where those huge chunks of ice break into the sea. And that does happen naturally, but climate change is kind of accelerating that process. So that's something that we want to stop, of course. And then, of course, couldn't do a print of Antarctica without including some penguins. So there's some cute little penguins on the bottom left which I think everybody likes. And yeah, that's me really. So that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I know it's something a little bit different to most of the work that we kind of do as cartographers and GIS people day to day, but it really was a bit of a labour of love of combining two things I'm very interested in, Antarctica and mapping and art and cartography and all those sorts of things. And I really loved creating it actually, and I was very proud of the end result. It's been really well received, which has been great to see online and on Twitter and Instagram and things. And it won an award actually from the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists at the beginning of this year for their kind of Antarctic art competition. It is actually for sale. If anybody wants to buy it, you can buy it from my small business, and 20% of all the sales get donated to environmental charities, which is something that's really important to me. And you can find me with my kind of mappy work on Twitter, or other mappy and less mappy prints on Instagram and Etsy if you're interested.
Well, Jess, that's amazing. To see the work that goes into producing something like that is insane. I mean, you must have a lot of patience to
Yeah.
be able to carve that out. I don't think I'd have had the patience to do that. So fair play to you.
Cheers.
Yeah, no worries.
That's a
When
good one.
you've clearly wowed everyone, because there aren't any questions. There's just one comment from Nick England who says it takes him back to his old scribing days. So
Oh, really? Yeah,
yeah,
I can
I'm sure
imagine actually doing that cartography by hand when you had to pick everything out of the vinyl. It's kind of a similar
absolutely.
repetitive process.